What do you think when you hear the words, the Blitz Spirit? Perhaps it invokes images of stoicism, determination, the ability to make the best of it and triumph over adversity. This period of remembrance got me thinking about our modern understanding of unthinkable parts of history, including the Second World War. And I tell you, what I discovered genuinely left me stunned. The Blitz began on September 7th, 1940, when the German Luftwaffe launched a massive raid on London, targeting its industrial areas, docks, and other strategic targets. And the defiance of Britain as it endured 8 consecutive months of German bombings on a background of sirens echoing throughout the night sky is etched into our collective memory and immortalised in the phrase, the Blitz Spirit. However, what may surprise many people is that the idea of the Blitz Spirit isn't in fact true.
There's this thing that's been coined in recent decades of the Blitz Spirit. It never existed. It's not true.
And believe me, this entire video was a very sobering wake-up call for me. It is instead a misconstrued concept where people's grim willingness to carry on because, let's face it, they had no other choice, was interpreted, perhaps purposefully, into a propaganda tool, not just for the enemies, but for the future generations of allies. And it's defined by 2 words, endurance and defiance. And don't get me wrong, there was endurance in the face of external danger. People were going through constant bombardment together in cities like London, Liverpool, Bristol, Birmingham. They were absolutely exhausted. But on the whole, there was very little panic, and people still went about their daily lives and still went to work. As for defiance, there were no or very few calls for surrender. Our morale didn't implode, our war production kept up, and even people who were forced to leave London or go underground because of the bombs still returned to go to their jobs. But it's important not to be over-sentimental about this period of history. The idea of patriotism in the face of damaged buildings, piles of rubble, and hundreds of people being crammed into a tube station shelter with their battered suitcases and teddy bears did happen, but not in the way that we've been made to understand it. I mean, we were led to believe in the keep calm and carry on spirit, London can take it, and even shop windows had posters that said, bombed but not defeated. And the Blitz Spirit has even become a popular phrase in films and articles, and some even use it as an everyday term. For example, after the London bombings in 2005, journalists abroad claimed to see the spirit at play in gritty Londoners who chose to walk miles to work rather than stay at home panic-stricken. Boris Johnson described the fight against COVID-19 in terms of war, pledging that his administration will act like any wartime government and has sought to reassure the public that the country has the resolve and resources to win the fight. And Health Secretary Matt Hancock stated in early 2020, "Our generation has never been tested like this. Our grandparents were during the Second World War, when our cities were bombed during the Blitz. Despite the pounding every night, the rationing, the loss of life, they pulled together in one gigantic national effort." Now, I have a lot of problems with this wartime analogy being woven into our pandemic story, and you saw it loads on like social media with people using wartime language and formatting. I don't know, I don't want to get too pandemic heavy, but I see those 2 periods of history as extremely different because during COVID, carrying on as normal is exactly what we didn't do. Anyway, back to World War II. How could the government claim that people were generally cheerful, highly confident and taking the bombings with a good heart, whilst their homes, schools and lives were being systematically destroyed? But allegedly, during the height of the bombing, the Londoners' spirit was extremely good. But from a collection of personal letters and diaries from those who lived through it, the general consensus is that there was no high morale to be found. People instead spoke of the psychological effects, the fear of being trapped under the rubble of your own home or not being able to get to the shelter in time. And people also spoke about the sheer inconvenience, like massive craters in the road blocking buses from taking their usual route, which meant that people couldn't get to work. But the government did not read these or even consider them when measuring the morale of the country. What they saw were women continuing to hang their washing in bomb-churn gardens and children using bomb sites as their new playground. And this was falsely interpreted as high morale because from the outside in, it looked as though everybody was just carrying on as normal, not like they had a choice. Psychiatrists at the time even worried that there would be an epidemic of air raid phobia, and they prepared psychiatric hospitals for an influx of mental health casualties. But actually, there were fewer admissions in 1940 than there were in 1939 to these psychiatric hospitals. But this is golden. A leading psychoanalyst, Edward Glover, published a Penguin special in 1940 on how to conquer fear. His recipe was a simple pat on the shoulder and some firm words. He suggested carrying a packet of sweets or some biscuits or a flask of brandy to cheer up those unnerved by the bombs. Yep, I've just lost my home and everything that I love, but you know what? Give me a rich tea. People felt as though they were expected to take it, especially the working class who got the worst of the Blitz because they used to live near where they worked by docks and factories and their houses weren't very well built, so they felt that they'd suffered greatly and that the government owed them. And the thing is, it wasn't all camaraderie because some people exploited the crisis for their own gain, like bomb chasers who would follow the latest raids and then go and loot shops. And some people were actually charged to have a space on the tube to sleep at night and be safe. There were also other tensions, as cities outside of London felt that their suffering was being overlooked. Now, in many news reports, the town itself couldn't be named because of security reasons, but national newspapers and the BBC were guilty of downplaying the damage and casualties in some regional cities. Hull suffered terribly, with 85% of its buildings being destroyed, but it was only referred to in reports as a northeast town, and people were furious when they went to the cinema, but it was all about the destruction of Coventry. It was often up to the local papers to describe the losses and the strength of character, and morale suffered in other places that weren't as well prepared, like Coventry, Plymouth and Bristol. There was actually a mental stability report done in Hull, which was based on interviews with hundreds of survivors. These case studies showed that people developed serious psychosomatic conditions, including involuntary soiling and wetting, persistent crying, uncontrollable shaking, headaches and chronic dizziness. Men were found to indulge in heavy drinking and smoking after a raid and were prone to developing peptic ulcers. And one woman was bombed out of 3 different houses and watched the death of her sister and her 5 children, and her symptoms indicated an exceptional level of nervous collapse. So she lost everybody. She lost everybody. I mean, that's harrowing. Nevertheless, the conclusion from Hull was that its mental stability was nothing to worry about, and instead the government papered over the physical and psychological evidence that they had, and instead focused on stories that talked about the British resolve. And the propaganda film London Can Take It reinforced the idea that the British people were not going to be terrorised into submission. And you also had uplifting photographs that were widely distributed, like this one of a milkman picking his way through the rubble to still deliver his milk. Except it was fake. Yep, this milkman was actually the photographer's assistant, simply wearing a white coat. Another way that the public face of the Blitz Spirit simply concealed the reality of being bombed. A lot. And whilst we're on the theme of debunking, that infamous poster? Well, one of the ways in which propaganda was used was through posters, and these posters would contain striking images and catchy slogans and would be displayed in public spaces like bus stops, railway stations and billboards. They were to encourage people to stay strong and carry on their daily lives in spite of the bombings. And one of the most famous propaganda posters from the war was "Keep calm and carry on." However, it was never actually displayed during the war. Originally produced in 1939, it was intended to be used in the event of German invasion, and it was one of a series of 3 posters that would be used in the event of war. The others read, "Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory," and "Freedom is in peril, defend it with all your might." The Keep Calm design was never officially issued, and a very small number of original copies are still available to this day. Now, why was it never issued? Well, I couldn't actually find hardcore evidence of the deciding factor that it was never thrown out to the public, but I think it's probably because it sounds incredibly patronising? I don't know, but clearly in the height of destruction, someone somewhere must have looked at the poster and gone, "You know what, lads? Let's leave this one." The rediscovery of the poster was made in 2001, but it wasn't mass-produced until 2008, and then by 2009, it had become hugely popular. And that's why it's all over Facebook and stuff, and on mugs. When the Blitz ended on the 16th of May 1941, there was still fighting to be done, even though Hitler was left clearly frustrated that he had failed to break the British spirit, failed to bring Winston Churchill to the negotiating table, and failed to dent British war production. And yes, Nazi leadership was shocked by the British resilience, and the Führer then turned his attention to Russia, and by the end of the year, the USA had entered the war. The indomitable spirit demonstrated in the UK across 1940 and 1941 has since been invoked by politicians to galvanise national pride and the media to recall fondly an era when apparently we were made of sterner stuff. It is even regarded in many people's hearts as simple Britishness. But I, for one, think that there's other, more subtle ways that the Blitz actually shaped national character. It wasn't all about putting the kettle on. Speaking of which, this has gone very cold. There is certainly a modern tendency to focus on the glorious side of the Blitz and ignore the bloodshed. But it can't be denied that the tale of heroism against German might has forged our national identity. I mean, there's a reason everybody loves whipping out the bunting. And don't get me wrong, I am one of those people. And that's not to say that a spirit of unimaginable resilience wasn't present during World War II. It was. But we just need to appreciate that a rose-tinted view isn't only damaging, but can also take away from the true resilience that took place during a time of such terror. And that we must never forget. I hope this video hasn't broken your heart too much, and I'm still very much a nostalgia girly. You know, I love the 40s because of the decor and the music and the fashion, but if we're not careful, social media can sugarcoat things a bit too much. But let's face it, that's kind of what we're there for, because social media is an escape, but we have to keep truth at the heart of everything that we do. And although I might not always get it 100% right, I can promise you one thing, I do my best.